Hey everybody, hope you can hear me. Let me turn this up. Okay, so this is my first podcast in a long time, and it's going to be rusty, and I apologize for that. But you know what? I'll just start. So, why did I begin the course in China, which I'm actually really excited about? Because China in 2019 is our great trading rival, as anyone who's paying any attention at all to the news can tell. The tariff wars that are going on. It doesn't really matter who's president. China will be our great economic rival for the rest of our lives. Certainly my life, but probably yours as well. And maybe even militarily. I would say right now, Russia is still our greatest military rival, but China's coming on strong. A lot of tension. And by looking at World War II, we can gain, you Americans really don't know history, right? They don't know their own history, but they especially don't know the history of other countries. And by looking at World War II, we can get kind of a background at some of the tensions between the US and China. But probably more importantly, World War II created modern China, without a doubt, without a doubt. And so by looking at World War II, we can understand the course of World War II and the importance of China in the war, which is often super de-emphasized. But we can also, by looking at World War II, we can draw a direct line to the way China is, at least politically, not economically, but certainly politically and as a society in 2019. So just to throw out some numbing numbers at you, up to 20 million Chinese died in World War II. Can't even fathom that suffering. Maybe 80 million refugees in China during World War II, fleeing the Japanese. World War II totally upended Japanese society. A historian has argued that especially refugees, uh, in the traditional Japanese society pre-World War II, elders were venerated. But during a refugee situation, it was actually hard. Elders kind of, I hate to say it, they kind of got in the way if you're fleeing a Japanese attack. And so there was kind of an undermining of the traditional veneration of elders, not completely at all, of course, but it was different after the war than it was before the war because these Chinese had this experience, 80 million or so, of having to pick up and flee the Japanese army. Let me stop and add one point. When I'm talking about China in this period, if you go to Beijing, if you look on the map, which is now the capital of China, and you draw a line south all the way to the southern border of China, that is where the action occurred in World War II. China is an enormous country, obviously, with the largest population on Earth. So when I'm talking about the war in China, I'm really talking about the eastern half of China, especially the areas of China that bordered the Pacific Ocean. These were the wealthiest parts of China. These were the most populous parts of China. So when we're talking about the war, I just wanted to point out that we're talking about probably the eastern half, maybe a little bit less, but the eastern part of China, all the way up to the Pacific Ocean. So I just wanted to get that out there. Um, so the Chinese call World War II the War of Resistance or the War of Resistance to the End. It is a great, great nationalizing force in 2019 China, in the same way that World War II is a nationalizing force in Russia. The heroic resistance of the Soviet Union to Hitler's advance that began in 1940. So the memory of World War II is used often to create a sense of nationalism, a sense of oneness in China, a sense of a common purpose. And so, as I said, it's called the War of Resistance or the War of Resistance to the End. Now, what you had in China, there's a couple of points I want to make. Mida talks a lot about World War II being the death of pluralism in China. What does he mean by pluralism? It's really not that complicated. A pluralistic society is like the United States. It's a society with a diversity of ideas, principles, and peoples. A pluralistic society is diverse. China is actually very diverse ethnically, but it's not very diverse politically. The communist government, Beijing, the national government, it's kind of a my way or the highway society. You don't have competing political parties in China. You have one party. It's a one party state. There's no toleration for different kinds of politics in China, as it, this is something that we're all quite used to in the United States. So, one of the points he wants to make about China during World War II and the lasting impact of World War II on China is this, that it marks the death of a pluralistic societies. The competing factions in China, the nationalist government, which ultimately loses, and the communists, which win, they create forms of government that are unitary, that there's no dissent really allowed, no real dissent. And think about Hong Kong today. I wouldn't be surprised if the Chinese government doesn't move into Hong Kong during the course of this semester. I'm kind of surprised it hasn't by now. The folks in Hong Kong are fighting for basic democratic rights. They're fighting for pluralism. The Chinese government just does not understand that. I'm not apologizing for the Chinese government. I'm very critical of the Chinese government. But I just want to say the DNA of this unitary system, this lack of pluralism, this allergy to any kind of political diversity, it goes back to the measures that it took to defeat the Japanese during World War II. So that's really one of the important direct lines that we can draw between World War II and China, which started in 1937, ended in 1945, and China of today. Lack of any tolerance of any real kind of political diversity. Now, the reason Hong Kong has it is, I'll explain that in a second. It's got a unique history in the history of China. So, another point I want to make, don't take for granted that China would have resisted, don't take for granted that China necessarily had to fight the Japanese. It's kind of incredible that the Chinese fought the Japanese, given what they were facing and given the immense suffering that occurred during the war. What you had, the struggle against the Japanese was really a struggle against foreign imperialism, foreign rule in China. Um, the, for the United States and for the rest of the Allies, believe it or not, Japan had over 500,000 soldiers in China up until 1945. And if China had surrendered to the Japanese, then that would have meant 500,000 soldiers would have been used to fight against the Americans, the United States. And the U.S. did most of the fighting in the Pacific during World War II. The British did some fighting in Burma, but basically it was a U.S. theater. So that's 500,000 soldiers that the U.S. would have had to fight if the Japanese hadn't gotten involved in what they called the Chinese quagmire. The things didn't go as well as the Japanese thought they would in China. They thought that China was going to roll over and just accept Japanese rule. Far from it. That's not what happened. So don't take for granted that the Chinese didn't surrender, and we can actually be quite thankful that the Chinese didn't surrender during World War II. Okay, I'm going to stop that podcast. This podcast, there's going to be probably 6, 7, 8 podcasts today, but I give them to you in in bite-sized pieces. One last thing before I stop. I'm sure I'm going to miss. I'm going to say, I don't know. I'll make mistakes, historical mistakes. I don't go back and listen to these podcasts. If it's confusing, just email me. Don't make me feel too bad, but it's okay if you make me feel a little bad. So just kind of forgive me if I make like little errors, and if I make big errors, don't forgive me. Really point it out to me.